I'll start talking, Becky and Pam, because and then maybe the
Okay.
numbers will kind of come up as more people find the links. So, um, my name's Dr. Steve Willey. I'm the academic co-director of environmental education projects here at Birkbeck. And on behalf of the Birkbeck Climate Festival, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event. Across the festival, we've been thrilled to have such a diverse range of topics and conversations taking place. And we've worked hard to program the festival with the intention of fostering interdisciplinary thinking and creative solutions to some of the most pressing environmental challenges that we face. And tonight's event is no exception. It's titled, Why Do We Need Each Other? The Arts and Science of Sustainability Research. And the two speakers are Professor James Hammond, who's Professor of Geophysics in the School of Natural Sciences, and Dr. Pam Yeow, a reader in management. This particular event is one of several that's being co-programmed with the Birkbeck Centre for Environment and Sustainability, which is directed by Dr. Becky Bryant and also Pam. And I'm going to hand over to them. I just wanted to say thank you very much for hosting this evening. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And as you said, if you have a question, you should get that question ready by typing in the Q&A because the session's being recorded. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. So yeah, do start filling up the Q&A with typing what discipline you come from. That would be great to know who we have here. So our aim this evening is just to have a bit of a chat. Imagine we are sitting with coffee, cake, generally relaxed, and we just want to talk a little bit about our experiences of working across disciplines. So like, what do we mean by a discipline? Do we mean a subject that you might have studied at school, like maths or biology or chemistry? Or there's a danger that once we get into like our big academic specialization, we go slice and slice and slice and slice. And what we want to do actually as the Centre for Environment and Sustainability is to take it bigger again. So get away from that slicing, get away from those conversations with the people who know the words that you know, and create something that's bigger on particular challenges. So just wanted to quickly think about what interdisciplinarity is. So I had a look at it on one of these online dictionaries, and it says involving two or more academic, scientific, or artistic disciplines. And multidisciplinary has exactly the same dictionary definition, but some people like to make the distinction. So multidisciplinary is people from different disciplines talking to each other, but kind of basically staying with their own mindset and their own discipline heads on. So they bring things together, but they don't necessarily change the way they're talking. And interdisciplinarity, sorry, I've got my notes on a screen over there, so that's why I keep doing that, is about trying to integrate those different disciplines. So we just wanted to have a chat about being interdisciplinary, our experiences of being interdisciplinary, the things we value about people who come from different disciplinary backgrounds when we're doing research and teaching, and the things that have perhaps been tricky. And if hoping for some amusing anecdotes, perhaps didn't warn James and Pam that I was hoping for amusing anecdotes. So don't worry if you can't do it on the spot. But yeah, just a general sense of, what are the joys of working across disciplines, and then what are some of the challenges as well. So to start off with, I was wanting to get you guys to introduce yourselves. So what's your training? What discipline were you trained into? When did you come to Birkbeck? What teaching do you do? And what's your current research in environment and sustainability? And I'm going to alternate who gets to go first, but this time James gets to go first.
All right, thanks, Becky. I'm glad you had to look up the definitions as well, because I did exactly the same in preparation for tonight, because they do get quite muddled and confused in my head, let alone, and I'm sure everyone else's. In terms of who I am, so as Becky said, I'm a professor of geophysics at Birkbeck and School of Natural Sciences. In terms of my background, I like to tell people I went to school when I was 4 and I basically never left. So I'm properly institutionalized academic. And I did my undergrad in geophysics. So in terms of siloing, I started doing geophysics and I'm now a professor of geophysics, right? So I've never really left that discipline. But I would say in the last few years, I've definitely made a conscious effort to try and think about making my research a little bit broader. I guess that maybe comes with the comfort of having a permanent position at a university. You can take a few more risks in that side of things. And so thinking a little bit broader where the impacts of my research are. And so my research is really, my bread and butter is seismology, but looking at volcanoes in particular. And what I've been trying to do now is to branch that out into other areas of the earth. So I've got really into soil recently, using new technologies, new ways of monitoring and understanding the soil. And that's been a fun thing. That's definitely taking me out of my comfort zone, trying to learn new skills, and understand, a different discipline, right? Completely. And the other area is I've worked a lot in Northeast Asia, in Korea, in China, and use that network to try and build a group of really multidisciplinary people from lots of areas to try and think about environmental hazards in a broad sense and how we can learn lessons from each other and kind of target that at addressing, really big challenges, in particular in Asia. So I guess I'll finish there and I'll hand over to Pam, I guess.
Great. Over to you, Pam.
Right. So thank you for this opportunity. So I'm originally from Singapore, so not quite Northeast Asia, but I guess ancestors came from that part of the world, and came over to the UK several decades ago to do my master's and then my PhD. And I think I first got into this whole interdisciplinary thing because my PhD was using systems thinking, which is very much, if you do a Google search of it, thinking in terms of interconnections, systems, processes, patterns, and things like that, in understanding change management. And I did that at Sheffield. So systems thinking kind of basically looks at the interconnectedness of business and life at large, and basically sees the whole system as greater than the sum of its parts, if that makes sense. And I think that perfectly describes the interdisciplinary approach that I take in looking at environment and sustainability. I then spent a couple of years in Japan on a postdoc fellowship, and actually that was when you asked for an anecdote. I first encountered active and engaged recycling efforts because I lived in an apartment building, and I had to learn how to separate waste into plastic, paper, and compostables, and it was eye-opening. Not just because I couldn't read or speak the language very well, but I was also told off through a note that was stuck on my bin with my garbage still in it, because I had mistakenly mixed the waste. and over there, we don't have black bin bags. It's transparent, clear bin bags, so they can look and see what is in the garbage. So that was the point I actually started engaging with waste and rubbish, and that stuck with me, especially when I moved back to this over here. So connecting back to my PhD, I was interested in what behavioral changes were needed for people to get on board with, active, positive reusing, recycling, reducing. So how can we as a society manage the changes needed to get people, so people like us, society, businesses, organizations that sell us the stuff or make us buy things, and importantly, governments, so things like policy, to get on board with waste and how we can then promote sustainable behaviors and practices. I don't know what else was I supposed to say.
No,
But
that's
yeah,
grand. That's
that's when
grand.
I started being like the plastic bag lady, and it stuck.
Yeah, what a wonderful title. Yeah, so so we want to talk about research in a minute, but just before that, just want to have a bit of a think about teaching, because one of the glorious things about Birkbeck is that actually you can have people from a huge range of backgrounds in your classroom. So over the last 15 years that I've been teaching climate change to master's students, we always have a physicist or an engineer in the class, and they always ask the questions I can't answer. And we often have a photographer, or we had a filmmaker in last time, or somebody who did a history degree and now works in the civil service. So, and I don't feel like that is unusual in a Birkbeck classroom. So what would be really great would be to talk to you a bit about your teaching and whether there's any interdisciplinarity there. So like what are the disciplinary backgrounds of your students? What do you teach? How often do you teach material that's outside of your disciplinary area? Does anyone ever make James teach things that aren't geophysics, for example? How does that material enhance your teaching? And then how do you manage the different disciplinary backgrounds? Is it always a challenge? Is it sometimes an opportunity to enhance students' learning? So any kind of musings along those lines, really, about how you bring students from different disciplinary backgrounds together in the classroom. And I think Pam gets to start. Yeah.
Oh God. I think in the business school it's always quite diverse. Even in the previous place, but I think even more so in Birkbeck. And rightly so. So we have civil servants, we have entrepreneurs, we have students of all ages and levels, and I think it's great. So, and also I taught on your MSc program as well, and that was fascinating meeting geography students who were also then saying that they were civil servants or entrepreneurs and co-founders and things like that. So, you know, it's great. So I think because because the topic of environment and sustainability is quite diverse, it can be applied in most disciplines, at least within the business school. So I teach leadership and change management at master's level and foundation level. And at least on master's on the MBA level, we talk about something that's kind of newish, over and above the sort of like common leadership theories and models around regenerative leadership, which we're keen to explore, and this sense that you know, you need this kind of leadership to bring about you know, this kind of leadership so that we can redesign organizations to address this sort of interconnected problem and challenge of environment and sustainability. So, you know, you can't continue to do things same old. So how do we then redesign organizations through obviously better structures or different structures and different leadership cultures and approaches, so that these organizations will be, for want of a too broad a word, better organizations that don't pollute the world, or, you know, offer positive solutions that we currently need. So regenerative leadership is something quite fascinating, I think, and students engage with it very much, because they kind of also see the problem, and I think that's the beauty of a lot of our students, that, you know, can't pull the wool over their eyes and, you know, present the problem, and they're like, so what do you want to do about it? And yeah, so we talk about that. Yeah.
And do you ever, just to follow up before we go to James, do you ever find your students like talking at cross purposes to each other because they come from different places, or do they manage to engage together around that topic?
I think out of conflict comes a lot of better understanding. So I think we have a very sort of Chatham House rules kind of environment where there's no stupid question, and people are quite respectful, which I think is so important as well when we're trying to argue. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, and I think when people don't understand, I think the important question is to say why, and can you explain it to me, as opposed to, oh, that's nonsense. So rather than cutting people down, is kind of like, right, we try and open up the conversations. And like, oh, this is the, civil servants might say, oh, this is the policy. Someone who's an entrepreneur might say, why was that policy put in? And then we start talking.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Pam. So James, what's your experience? I imagine the classrooms are slightly different in the School of Natural Sciences.
Yeah, and they do pretty much just let me teach geophysics, right? I mean,
Nice.
But it's a big module, but it's so that's what I teach, and we have mostly a mix of we have students at undergrad anyway doing geology or planetary science with astronomy and astrobiology. So they're all kind of science focused, I would say. But coming from a different university that I won't name to Birkbeck, I mean, the difference in the students in the classroom is remarkable, right? And it's one of the best things about being at Birkbeck is the students, because they're challenging and they'll push you because they have a lot of life experience, right? And they bring that into the classroom. So I find that really quite rewarding. The other element of teaching that I do, which is a little bit more out of my comfort zone, is the projects. I have to coordinate all the projects across the school. So I have to make sure, every student gets a project they want to do. And actually at master's level, that includes a lot of the biology focused students as well. And that is quite fascinating, right? And obviously I lean a lot on other members of the department to know what skills they have. But going to the talks, the posters, and I have to sit there and try and mark a lot of this work. And that definitely takes me out of my comfort zone. And I really enjoy that side of things, is sitting there trying to understand what it is they're doing, and then being that person that can ask the really naive question, right? Because and that I think gets to the heart of kind of interdisciplinary research, right? Is having the confidence to ask that really naive question because you just don't understand, the language or the concept or what's being done here. So I think that's been a lot of fun this year. We've been doing that this year. And then the other, maybe a little outside of Birkbeck, I get invited a lot to teach on classes on science diplomacy. So with the World Academy of Science, with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in Korea a little bit and elsewhere. Because I work, for those that don't know, I work a lot in North Korea, and it's kind of held up as an example of science diplomacy. And that's been a lot of fun. The AAAS, the World Academy of Science and American Association for the Advancement of Science, that workshop brings together a diplomat and a scientist from countries all over the world, so particularly focusing on the global south. And that's a really fascinating crowd, because you talk about your science from your perspective, and you're talking about science diplomacy, and you have the diplomats that approach it from one direction compared to the scientists, whether they're social sciences or natural sciences, from the other direction. And that's led to some incredibly kind of fascinating discussions around how science and policy and diplomacy all kind of mix and come together.
You're muted.
Well, sorry, we'll stick with that topic. And James gets to go first next time. And we'll move on to research. So nice segue, because we've already talked a little bit about research already. So if you could just expand a bit, James, for us on how the different disciplinary perspectives work together to achieve your research aims, maybe in the context of a couple of specific projects. And then what, you don't need answers to both of these, but these are just kind of to spark some thoughts. So like, what's the most fruitful cross-disciplinary collaboration that you've ever had? And what's the most amusing or tricky thing you've had to negotiate in order to work across disciplines? So,
yeah, I mean, yeah, sticking a little bit on the science diplomacy angle, I think that's been really interesting because it's, when I was looking up the definitions, there's a third one, right, which is transdisciplinary, which kind of bringing in people from outside of academia, outside of the academic realm. And I think that's been something that we've done a lot with the work in North Korea, right? Because we can only do that work if it, with the support of international governments, the UN, the North Korean government, all have to come together to allow us, you know, to work and do what we do. And so that's been fascinating. And for the first 10 years, I just kind of, it was just happening, right? And I didn't really think too much about it. And we just kind of did that. But the last 3 years, I've been working on a NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellowship, which was to work a bit more closely with the Royal Society, with the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office to think about how we could expand science engagement with North Korea, but also to take a step back and think, you know, what are the lessons that we've learned from doing our work? How can we try and capture that information from diplomats, from you know, other stakeholders that have been working within our project? And it's quite timely because, you know, particularly what's happened with the war in Ukraine and everything, and there's been more sanctions and more impacts. So that's been interesting. I've been working with a colleague at UCL who works, he's a lecturer in science diplomacy. He comes at it from very much a policy, kind of political science perspective. And we've been working together to try and understand from his perspective, what's the impact of our research been on science diplomacy, right? And that's been really fascinating to be a bit of a subject of the research, right, as opposed to just being the researcher itself. So that's been a lot of fun. The other example I would use was last year in August, building a little bit on our work in North Korea, we got funding to do a big conference in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, in August 2024. And that we really just reached out and we said we were going to have a conference on environmental hazards. And we wanted people from all disciplines to come together for 3 days in Ulaanbaatar, and we would have conferences and meetings to chat and discuss hazards from all these perspectives, and then we would have one day of just open discussion to try and explore some of the big areas and topics. I think we had about 140 people came from 20 countries across Asia, and it was fantastic. You know, we had natural scientists, social scientists, philosophers, psychologists, people working on governance. We had government agencies, people working in disaster management, NGOs, all there together. And the discussion, you could see everyone was quite nervous at the beginning. They didn't really know what to expect, including us. But it just turned into this amazingly open discussion where people were honing in on the same kind of issues, but from very different perspectives. And we've got support to run that again in 2026. And we're trying to now use that to build it into a community across Asia who are thinking about these topics and opening up opportunities, right, to be in the same room with other disciplines who are thinking about the same problems, but from very different perspectives. And I think on the other part of your question, I think that leads into the challenge of interdisciplinary research is one around language, right? And having opportunities where we can spend time in the same place together, and particularly if you can't escape to go off and do other things, you're just there, means you're forced to think about things from other people's language. You're forced to kind of dig into what they actually mean, and by this, and realize that you're talking about the same thing but without being able to communicate. And it reminds me of a story when we was working out in Ethiopia, in the Afar region of Ethiopia, and there's lots of volcanoes erupting. There was big earthquakes. There's a lot going on, and we were there with scientists, and we were trying to talk to local communities about what they were experiencing. But of course, we spoke English. Our colleagues from Addis Ababa University spoke English and Amharic. And then the Afar some Afar spoke Afari and Amharic. But there was no one who spoke Afari in English, for example. So like we would have these discussions around quite complex issues, and we would explain what we want, and the question would go from English to Amharic, and then Amharic to Afari, and then they'd have the big discussion for 20 minutes, and then Afari to Amharic, and then Amharic back to English. And at the end of it, you'd completely lost any context or meaning of what you were trying to understand, right? And that was kind of inevitable. And I think we do that in academia as well, right? When the natural scientist talks to the social scientist who talks to someone from government working in disaster management, we can all be saying the same thing, but actually at the end of the day, no one actually understands each other, right? And so I definitely think that's a huge challenge, and it only gets resolved by spending time together, and taking the effort to try and understand where the other side is coming from.
And have you got ways in which you would break that down in order to create that understanding? Like, is there a kind of strategy? Obviously, time is really valuable, but you can spend time talking past each other as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm at the beginning of that journey, I would say, of trying to understand that. I know there's strategies, particularly with these kind of meetings, where you can do. So what we did was break into small groups, lots of post-it notes, just getting people to write down what their big challenges from their perspectives, try to group those together, so that we could see those commonalities that were coming out, even if people were approaching it from different angles. And what our goal there was to identify the problems, right? Not necessarily solutions, but to say, what are those big questions that we should be tackling that everyone seems to agree are big issues, right? And then we could start thinking about how we might address those. What's the data? What's the communities that you need to engage with? Those kind of questions.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to move on to Pam, but just before I do, just want to highlight that if you're interested in the report that came out of the conference that James is talking about, I've put the link in the chat. That link goes to the website, and there's a little video or a report, depending on your mode in which you like to receive information. Are they broadly the same message, or are they slightly different messages, James? I haven't had a chance to look at them yet.
The video's a bit more about what we did, what the conference was like, and it hears from some speakers. It's quite a nice video if you want to see the Mongolian steppe and everywhere where we kind of got out into the field. It's quite nice. The report goes into a bit more detail about the outcomes of a bit more considered, I would say. Yeah, but thanks, Becky, for highlighting that.
No, you're welcome. So it's not an either or. It's both and. Great. So Pam, perhaps you could tell us now about interdisciplinarity in your research.
I cannot beat that story. Not that I want to. It's fascinating, and I'm now trying to think, how can I get invited onto that 2026?
Everyone's welcome, Pam. Everyone's welcome.
Brilliant. I'll just pick up on what you said about the language, and you talked about sort of like different languages, English and other different languages, and people having to find competent translators and things like that. But then there's also, I think, the vocabulary, because I don't really have an example at the top of my head now about environment and sustainability, but I do remember when I was working very closely with colleagues in University of the Arts, which is the university that we collaborated with for the first ever MBA between a business school and a creative school. And there were they started talking about the word briefs, like writing briefs, and I had no clue. 10 years ago, I had no clue what they were talking about. And it really, I really felt like I was speaking a different language, or that they were speaking a different language. I finally understood once they showed me an example, and I can't remember now what word I used, but I was like, oh, you mean, whatever. And they were like, yeah, brief. And that's when I felt like I needed a thesaurus, or one of those at the top of the table of contents, abbreviations and things like that. Like this means this. Yeah, and I think that took time to actually get sort of like a joint language that we both understood. Not just individuals, but like different schools. So even though we were all, say, university institutions, we were talking at cross purposes. And I think that's one thing that needs, in a way, sorting out if we were to find solutions for these big grand challenges that we're trying to address in the field of environment and sustainability. And to get out of silos, I think is so important. And so again, I'm going to try and make that conference my go-to conference in 2026. Becky, we need to go. Yeah. In terms of collaborations, I think all the collaborations I've had in the past have been fantastic, but I have to shout out our research center for environment and sustainability, not because I am a co-founder, but I think I have learned so much, even this afternoon, about parasiticides. Yes, and I'm thinking, what do I do with my cat now and her fleas? But I've been separately. We've had PhD, postgraduate research showcases, and I've learned so much about soil, insects, rivers, indigenous people, and influencing policy at UN. I mean, just for start. So it's incredible what we can do if we expand that showcase to include, and we were so happy to have colleagues, their supervisors came along as well and afforded some insights, further insights beyond this research. And I live for the day when, more of these sort of like collaborations come together. And people kind of say, yeah, I've got someone who can do that for you, and then a whole branch of new ideas come out. I think that would be excellent. And I think that's the point of collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a question for you. So James was talking about working with the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. You've obviously worked with a lower tier of government, with local government. What sorts of things did you experience trying to work together with them? Were there things where you didn't understand each other, or were you able to talk the same language relatively easily?
I think that's an interesting question. I think the differences came from perhaps personal views versus official views. Dare I say that? So I think there's always this, when you talk to people and trying to entice them to support your research, and they're all like, yeah, we totally, we agree with you. We even do that. We've asked similar questions to you about, waste disposal in our in our households and things like that, for example. When it comes to like policy and what can engender change, it's a lot more than just complaining about waste disposal. It's either about going through various almost like endless steps to get policy approved, or I guess in this country, there might be, and I can't imagine that happening in the world stage, but there may be issues like local government is not the same as council government, not the same as national government. So you could have, like the Labour government that's running nationally, but you might have a Lib Dem Green local council, or some other version of a mix of government at the local level, and funding levels coming from different parts of government, and that's when it gets quite confusing. Not like the world stage, of course, but it gets quite frustrating still. So I like to think that the local politicians probably are not very far from how we envisage environment solutions or sustainability solutions, but there are perhaps constraints because of official positions. And I feel very sad about it, because I think there's a lot more in common that we all have, apart from, I guess, the far ends of each spectrum. I think most of us are within that 70-80% of understanding and sharing the same common views. So I think taking that on board, I think we have more in common than not, and we should actually try and work towards that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pam. So I have a final question for you both, with only one part, so that's good, because we get to a stage where we can't quite remember all my multi-part questions. And while I'm asking that and James and Pam are answering it, I'm just going to pop a link to the feedback form in the chat, and also, well, not chat, sorry, Q&A, and invite people to start typing any questions that they might have, or comments, or experiences, and then I will read those out in a minute. But first of all, our final question is, we've heard a little bit about this from Pam already, so I'm going to go to James first. What do you value about being part of the Birkbeck Research Centre for Environment and Sustainability? Over to you first, James.
Yeah, I'm really glad it exists. So congratulations to you and to Pam for setting it up in the first place. I know it's a lot of work, right? Putting it together and getting it off the ground. And I'm really glad it's happened, and you making a success of it, because it's something I've long thought, that at Birkbeck we have a lot of people working on environmental issues across all of our faculties, right? Whether it's law, business, the social sciences and the humanities, the natural sciences. So to have that all come together and discuss things, I think it was long overdue, and I'm really glad it's happening. And I enjoy coming to the meetings and ideas sessions and all of that kind of thing. So I've learned a huge amount. What I value, obviously one thing I value is the huge support you gave for the Mongolian conference that we did last year. Right, and Birkbeck supported that conference financially, as well as with in-kind support. And we had people like Chao Cheng, who came to Mongolia and talked about environmental hazards from a governance perspective, right? So just that idea of, I've made all these connections and people that I don't think I would have done, even though we're all in the same building, working on related topics. Without that research centre, I just don't think we'd have found each other, basically. So I think that's probably what I would value most about it.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely one of our aims. Pam, do you have anything to add?
I second everything that James said, but also I think I just want to add that I think the value of being part of, or having set this up, is that I get to meet and talk with colleagues and external partners and organizations from different areas than the usual, and to think of activities and events that are, again, different from the usual. The usual being my usual patch. So and also I think finding commonalities. I think going back to we're not really that different, and which means that we have similar views but potentially different solutions. And if we just joined up together, I don't know which mathematician said 1 + 1 isn't 2, it's more than 2. So mind blown. So I think we need to do more of that. It's a huge challenge that hits all of us, whether we're moms or academics or teachers or bus drivers or whatever. So we need to find a solution.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks, James. So, do we have any questions? Everyone was stunned into typing silence by listening to your wonderful answers. So we'll give them a couple of minutes to get their fingers going, and if not, everyone can go back to a real cup of coffee rather than our virtual cup of coffee that we have here. Let's see if there's any questions come through.
The challenges, I think, whilst we wait for people to write or ask questions, do you think that what do you think are the challenges of interdisciplinary work?
I think finding it at home is definitely a challenge, isn't it? So finding we have a question from Lisa, by the way. Finding journals that are willing to publish, and finding funders who are willing to fund, because it's sort of at the edges of their remit, and so it's easier to just
it's easier
push
to say
it
no,
somebody else.
isn't it? Yeah, it's easier to say no and kind of say, oh, our journal is focused on X and you're just that far.
Yeah.
So
we have a question from Lisa, who says, thank you both for very interesting accounts. Question for James. Engaging diplomats and the UN Secretariat can be difficult. From my own experience working with them, as in the UN, around issues of multilingualism. Often those who engage have some expertise allied to our own and/or a passion for the issue. Can you offer any nuggets of wisdom about engagement or tales from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because our interaction with diplomats and the UN hasn't been about trying to influence policy change necessarily, right? With those groups, so it's a little bit different. It's been more that, in our case, we wanted to study a big volcano that everyone was worried might erupt again. So that's kind of how we got involved. We were invited by the North Koreans, and we went over. And we quickly realized there was lots of work we could do together to study it. And because we have a British embassy in Pyongyang, they kind of wanted to support it from day one because they want engagement with North Korea. So it's not really a policy change. It's more just, and they could clearly see an area of mutual interest that we could work together on. And then once sanctions got extended on North Korea, science was basically stopped. You weren't allowed to collaborate with North Korea on any science collaboration, a bit like what exists with Russia now. But the British government kind of wanted this to continue, so through them we worked with the UN Security Council to get an exemption from this sanctions. And in fact, that was the first time anyone had done that on a scientific level. So we kind of laid some groundwork for how that can be done now. So in a way, there's a little bit of a policy change there, but that was kind of done by circumstance and done, I guess, touching on your question, not necessarily expertise, but certainly they had a clear motivation to support us. So it came from them as much as it did from us in terms of developing that relationship and then working together over this period. And now, I think we're the only bilateral project that exists between North Korea and the UK at the moment. So again, there's a clear motivation for the UK embassy to help us with our projects. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Lisa may type or may not type. We shall see. So we also have a question from Joanne, who says, as someone who works in the arts, I'd be interested to know whether you've collaborated with arts colleagues, and if not, whether you could imagine doing so. I don't know whether that's us as individuals or us within the centre. Shall I talk for the centre first, and then we can talk about
why don't you
individuals?
take that question? Yeah, why don't you take that question?
Yeah, so absolutely, definitely. That's one of the things that we think is unique and different and special about Birkbeck, that it's not just the more kind of pragmatic science and social science people who are doing things around environment. I think that what we have to do is we still have to work out how to have those conversations. So there's the beginnings of conversations. So for example, Heike has a PhD studentship with the Royal Veterinary College around care and practices of care and human and animal relationships. We also supported an artist-based thing that Burmax were doing, where, gosh, it's a bit difficult to explain, but basically they got a bunch of students in to pretend to be bees, and to sort of map that out and use some VR and that sort of thing. And so I think that's quite exciting. And I think Simon Pooley's actually wanting to do an exhibition about representations of okapi, and of course the exhibition that's on at the Peltz at the moment, about the Amazon, that we weren't involved with that as a centre, but it's very much the sort of thing that we are interested in building links across. So there's photographs of the Amazon. I haven't been yet, but I'm keen to. It's on my reminder list. Yeah, Pam, did you want to add anything to that?
And I think there was a MA student who approached us about working with someone in the photography. Wasn't there?
Oh no, that was PhD student.
Oh, yeah.
So someone's come in through the centre. Someone's come in to do a PhD with someone who works more on that arts and humanities side.
The visual arts side, which we thought was something important. Yeah,
Neolithic archaeology and sound art and that sort of thing. So yeah, really keen to expand those collaborations and to ensure that we really are talking across all the disciplines. Yeah. James says, Lisa says that you answered the question. No, I was just going to feed back to James that Lisa's happy with the answer to her question. What were you going to say, Pam? Sorry.
No, and I think that we've worked very hard for every event that we host, whether it's a knowledge or community one or research, to include all three faculties. And obviously all three faculties have, within them 8 schools, so it's not always possible to have 8 representatives, but I think so far we've been okay. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question, Joanne. And Joanne, if you have any ideas, great ideas, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, if anyone's got ideas, that'd be really good. Really keen to catalyse those conversations and to include everybody. I think we have run out of questions. So all that remains is for me as the chair to thank both James and Pam very much for their insights and their sharing their experiences, and thank you all for coming and watching in the future because it's been recorded, and watch this space. The Research Centre is continuing to do things, and we would love to have you part of that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Big
Thank you
thanks
for
to
this
Becky as well for hosting
as our chair. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to end the event now and end the recording.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.